Hello, world. My next guest and I have known each other since 2004, long before the days of Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn. He is revolutionizing the way we think about performance and authenticity when it comes to marketing, and he continues to be curious about scholarly communication and the sociology of academic life. Please join me in welcoming Jeff Pooley, Professor of Media and Communication at Muhlenberg College. Jeff, are you ready to get radically transparent with me today?
Yes, I am, and it's so great to be with you, Jen.
I mean, this is a blast from the past that I am totally on board for. I've been dying to pick your brain since the moment that I graduated Muhlenberg, in being so proud to be in marketing and taking the words that you've ever so, graced me with in the classroom days. But for everyone listening in, because you're quite a loved professor and one of the most brilliant I've come across, would you be able to give us a brief look at your professional and academic journey? And I know, you have your website, and if you go there, you have tons of publications, but how you found yourself where you are today, and just give us some background.
Sure, I'm happy to. I was interested in the media while I was an undergraduate, and there was no major, unfortunately, where I went. And I stitched together my own degree that was, in a way, a kind of media studies program. And after I left, I went into journalism for a year or two at a magazine that ironically covered the media. And having got that bug as an undergraduate and gotten a little bit more while I was working as a journalist in New York City, I decided to go back to graduate school and study the social impact of the mass media. And from there, I was hell-bent on going to a small liberal arts college as a professor, and there weren't a whole lot of programs that existed in such colleges that were devoted to media and communication. So I found my way to Allentown, Pennsylvania, and Muhlenberg College, where I met you back in the early 2000s.
Yeah, it's wild, right? And I know back in the day, if you will, it was funny because when you were a media communication major, kind of what you shared, right? You didn't even have this major when you went to school, and you created it yourself and had to be dynamic. That's almost in essence the field today of media and communication, of continuing to adapt and be dynamic and learning whatever digital ways we communicate and keeping track with it all.
It's remarkable that the class that you probably took and that I was teaching when I started out 19 years ago, which was Media and Society, happened before the iPhone was introduced in 2007, or Facebook was, merely an idea in Mark Zuckerberg's head in a dorm room. And by the time 2010 hit, social media was coming on the scene. And as a media professor, you have to radically transform what you're doing in the classroom. So the course that most directly connects to the stuff we're going to talk about didn't even exist as a possibility until around 2010, when I started teaching classes like social media and the self that get at this question of authenticity. And so that's what I've really been interested in my scholarship, and also exploring with students, is the question of performance on social media and how we come across, and in particular, how we attempt to come across paradoxically as authentic on platforms that ask us to be performers.
I'm hooked. I'm hooked, and I'm excited, and we're jumping in because I can't hold back anymore. I mean, this topic, it is fascinating. I want to know, right, as you explained all of these components, right, performance and authenticity, and I know you're going to give us this whole backstory and you have these incredible articles that you've written on the topic. But as a professor in this field, I have to ask, what on earth is keeping you up at night professionally?
Well, it's a great question. I would say the main thing that keeps me up at night professionally is how to best serve students. And I'll explain what I mean. Students come into a major like media and communication with an interest in getting skills training, and on the one hand, and faculty often are interested in getting students to think critically about the media saturated world that they have grown up in. And at some level, these are in tension with one another. The students want to learn how to write a press release lead, and the faculty want to talk about how public relations affects democracy. So that tension has always bothered me, because I want students to actually gain skills, and also, though, to be critical citizens. And the way that we at Muhlenberg have tried to address this dilemma is by mixing in media making training into classes that would otherwise be more oriented to the social impact of media. So students make media when they're analyzing it. They might, for example, do a podcast like this when they're analyzing the medium of audio in the podcast itself, if that's not too meta. The other related dilemma is that the softwares and the hardware that we introduce students to are always and already obsolete by the time they're at college. And this poses a problem, right? Because to do any practical training in any specific software or hardware isn't serving students that well. And so there again, we've kind of focused on teaching the principles of media making rather than any specific, software skill set that would, after all, be better learned, we think, on the job.
Absolutely. I'm going to actually jump forward ahead and then we're going to come back. But right, you're talking about kind of the gap in the skill set, and it's an interesting run, whether you call it the Great Resignation right now or the Great Reshuffle. I think many would agree with you that there is a widening gap, especially when it comes to, maybe the old school way we used to work versus what we're working on today. And so I'm just curious, and I know you mentioned kind of a little bit how you combine theory with practicality and upskilling, but what, in your opinion, is the best way for universities and professors to keep up with the ever-changing technology to enable students in this field? If there's even, if there's something you've learned or noticed.
Yeah, I have faced this challenge every semester. And I know all my colleagues do as well. The way I handle it, and I'm teaching classes that are on artificial intelligence and algorithms, for example, or social media in the self, as I mentioned. And one way I cope with this as a teacher is to just read voraciously in the trade literature in particular. I mean, ironically, the academic stuff is out of date by the time it's published. It takes 2 years to get through the publishing pipeline. And so I rely on the trade press and also smart journalists at places like The Atlantic to keep me updated. And another thing I do is tell students in a class like social media in the self that the object of study, the very thing that we're going to talk about, won't look the same by the time we're in week 12 that it does on the first day of class. And just to make that straightforward, the other more practical thing I do is strongly encourage students to do internships along the way, both for their own viability as a job candidate, but also just to get some of that exposure that's changing constantly that we don't see in the groves of academia.
So this is exactly why you're on the Radically Transparent podcast, right? Because the way that you're radically transparent with your students about the ever-changing landscape of marketing and digital communication, right? It's the core of our show. So I'm going to circle back because you began to speak about, when we first kicked off authenticity and performance. And we know, right, as B2B marketers, that there's this huge push right now and a lot of initiatives and strategic momentum in organizations to have employees share their story. And much of marketing is sharing the right story at the right time from the right person. And there's this whole push about being authentic. It's a word that right during 2020, all of us, it's like the buzzword that has lingered around. And many of us marketers are tapping into this idea of, if you're authentic on social media, right? You're able to get better results. Leading us to the question, is this even really authentic to begin with if there's a strategy behind it when we start? Could you help us understand this dilemma and a little bit about your research and how, as marketers, we can still be authentic while also having very high performing teams and using authenticity as a strategic driver?
Yeah, well, it's a great question. You've hit on the central paradox, and I'll just briefly describe what I think are the challenges, which I'm sure anyone working in the field already recognizes. But just the ideal of authenticity itself, first of all, it would have been utterly baffling to our 18th century ancestors. It's a very modern ideal. It's associated with capital R romanticism in the 19th century. And the idea basically that each of us has an inner self that we can discover and then should express was this ideal that spread to the regular population in the 20th century in the West. And it already is kind of stitched in with some paradoxes, because first of all, one would be well before Facebook got underway, everyday life is shot through with performance. That is to say, when we're interacting face-to-face or over Zoom, or in the classroom or anywhere else, we are managing the impressions we give off, which is to say, if we want to come across as sincere, as unrehearsed, as spontaneous, that actually ironically requires some stage management, which is to say some effort. In other words, in everyday life, it's already the case that it takes some effort to come off as effortless, right? And you can see the tension there. On social media, this paradox is heightened. And the reason, in a word, is that the performative control that you and I have when it comes to an Instagram or TikTok is so much greater than it is in spontaneous conversation. You can decide when to hit post and edit yourself and so on. And yet you're still attempting to come off as unrehearsed and spontaneous. The fact is, everyone knows that everyone has this extra performative control. So if in everyday life there's already lots of tension between performance and authenticity, it's all the more so on social media. And then I'll just mention a third facet that is probably most interesting to your audience, that when we mix in selling, which is to say selling yourself, selling a product, selling a brand.
We have social selling today, right on social media, right?
Exactly. That the paradox is even greater. And the reason is because, of course, the idea that you are aiming at something, that you have calculation in mind, strategy, is at odds with the very ideal itself, which is meant to be unrehearsed and without any motive. So the paradox in particular, when you're mixing selling in, is that you have what I would call calculated authenticity that is with a motive. And in a way, the message that the culture gives to everyday people, but maybe even more to, let's say, influencers who are working for a brand, is to be true to yourself. It is to your strategic advantage, this kind of mixed message, right? And so the challenge then is that everyone is yearning for authenticity, in part because there is so much selling going on, that there's so much kind of instrumental requests for purchasing or joining or whatever in everyday life. That's why we want since everyone's trying to hustle us, we want the unhustled life, or let's say. And that leads to a kind of never-ending cat and mouse cycle, you could say. And so that's just setting up the challenge.
Yeah. So I'm just kind of, right, our whole value proposition is around this, when it comes to employee advocacy, which is basically advocating for your brand to do it in an authentic way. But it really does challenge you as a marketer to really rethink, perhaps, how do we continue to be authentic, right? In a meaningful way, yet strategically, which is a complete paradox. Now, social media, I think, makes a lot of things messy, but I have to confess, it's one of my most favorite topics to talk about. It's one of my most favorite places to hang out. And in B2B marketing, we often are talking about personalization. And I know it's something that you actually brought up in one of your articles that I've recently read, where you were talking about, and keep me honest, right? Feel free to chime in, but you were talking about basically when it comes to social media, right? We once were living in a world that was quite segmented. And so by segmenting our audiences to receive that right message at the right time was quite easy to do. And then enter social media, makes everything a mess. And at the moment, social media audiences are quite diverse, and they're not really a place for segmentation. Yet you'll hear, right, in a strategy meeting across marketing leaders, right? The first question is, how are we segmenting our audience? How are we segmenting our customers? And it's all about segmentation. So how can marketers or brands, whichever kind of arena we want to take a look at, tackle this idea of being authentic on social media when social media itself does not really provide a brand or a marketer with with a segmented audience, and it's quite mixed and everybody's together. So does that question make sense? Do you know where I'm trying to get with that?
It does. And so, one strategy, and I'm not saying that it's the best one, is to sort of lower the bar a little bit. And that is to say, to just run with the old mass marketing, leaving B2B to the side for a moment, approach, which is to kind of own the paradox. I think of history of mass advertising where the main message is to be a rebel, be an individual, to be a black sheep, on behalf of an advertising message that is selling something that's mass produced. I think of Apple's, Think Different campaign, or every other car ad that on earth that's asking you to be an individual to buy a mass produced product. It will always be read correctly as a contradiction, but it's worked. So in other words, just kind of selling the authenticity ideal and not trying to personalize it is one option. The other way, though, of course, you can see emerging is to take the data troves that companies gather on audiences and feed back to them pseudo intimate interactions. And I don't, this doesn't apply directly to social media necessarily, but the whole world of chatbots in particular is really fascinating, as you might have followed and see in therapy apps and elsewhere, where there's an attempt to take inputs, perhaps previously known data about someone, and feed them back what seems like a kind of human and even quote unquote authentic interaction. And I suppose the strategy that one could adopt, even though it has some creepiness and therefore a boomerang potential with audiences, is to simulate what a kind of human conversation is like by way of the data double that exists on each of us in the ether, so to speak.
Fascinating. I feel like I have to edit some creepy music in as you explain that because it is creepy, but it does make a lot of sense. And I think what I've learned in the field for quite some time is that personalization is what audiences do expect. So even though there's a level of creepiness, there's also a level of expectation for it. So also matching, right, what the people say they want. Right? So that's an interesting one. I want to ask, right, we're talking about authenticity. We said earlier, right, it can be staged. In your opinion, should it be staged? If yes, why? If not, why not?
Well, I think it's unavoidably staged because of the tension that's just built in from the beginning, setting aside social media, setting aside marketing, that there is just a tension between the presentation of self and the expectation that we be authentic. So I think it's fair to say that authenticity is always already undermined by the instrumental purpose that's behind it. But that doesn't mean it's not worth invoking. It's just, I think, B2B marketers and others just have to assume that it's an unstable ideal, that you can go for it, but it's always going to be challenged. There are artifice detectives out there. There are authenticity police, and they're always going to call out the contradictions and in effect be yearning for quote unquote the real thing. And then the marketers can follow up on that real thing. And it's, as long as it's understood to be this unstable, never ending game of catch up, then I think it's worth pursuing. But it's never going to be easy. It's always going to be fraught with paradox and contradiction.
So may we all be aware of the authenticity police and keep going with our initiatives. So listen, as we wrap up, I have two more questions for you. One is in regards to hiring. And I say that because, as we mentioned, right, we're in this great resignation, or again, great reshuffle, however you want to call it. And there are so many organizations that are looking for talent. and you're on the front lines with students. You've been radically transparent, sharing, right, that technology is changing faster than the speed of light. You're setting the expectations with students. But what advice would you give to B2B organizations looking to grow their marketing teams with students who are, right out of university in their first year in quote unquote the real world? Where do you think the biggest gaps will lie, and how do you think organizations can help students integrate into that society best with just such an ever-changing dynamic tech stack?
Yeah, I mean, given that the students coming out right now are damaged by the pandemic, in part, it's a great challenge. I would just say, though, that the advice that I suspect many people already know is the one I would give, and it has nothing to do with the pandemic. It's that I think it's always in B2B, in any area of marketing, crucial to screen for good writers, and that alone. I think actually good writing is, as I think most businesses will agree, kind of a rare trait and utterly crucial. But more importantly, it also is like a proxy in my career of teaching hundreds and hundreds of students. It's a proxy for overall student and therefore employee quality down the road. So it's an old school medium, an old school skill, but it's by far the one that's the most predictive of a success in a job, and in B2B included.
I couldn't agree more with you. And I won't even get into, right, like when I think about, right, social media managers who are, right, they're talented writers, and then they're limited to 140 characters. I think that's a challenge in its own. So with that being said, I'm going to head into the last question, which is actually one of my favorites, because as we were talking about, right, everybody's leaving and living kind of in this meta world on social media and leaving digital footprints wherever they go. And in my due diligence of researching you, Jeff, I looked at your LinkedIn profile. It's impressive. I looked at your website. My jaw was dropping. What's one thing you can tell us about yourself that we actually can't learn about you from simply looking at your LinkedIn profile?
Well, one thing is that though I am a professor, I have a side job, which is that I run a small scholarly publishing firm that's nonprofit and that is open access, which means that the books and articles that are published are free to read. And I have taught myself over the last 3 years the ins and outs of the publishing industry. It's called mediastudies.press, which is also its web address, and it's become a new passion.
That sounds incredible. So anyone listening in, could you say the address one more time?
Sure, it's media studies, all one word, .press. That's the web address and the name of the press.
Fantastic. So I'll be sure to go check it out. If anybody listening today wants to continue the conversation, get radically transparent about performance and authenticity, or just have a meaningful conversation around media and communication or Muhlenberg, where is the best place that somebody can reach you?
Well, I am on Twitter at Jefferson Pooley. That's all one word. And I also am on my website, jeffpooley.com. I have my email and other forms of contact. So I'm happy to continue the conversation.
Fantastic. Jeff, it was a pleasure to have you. Thank you for getting radically transparent with me. And I have a hunch we're going to be going to round 2 because we have a lot more to talk about.
Thank you so much, Jen. It was just fabulous to talk today.
Thanks for tuning in to the Radically Transparent podcast, brought to you by Oktopost, the only social media management and employee advocacy platform architected for B2B. I'm Jennifer Gutman, your host and director of social strategy here at Oktopost. And if you love today's show, we'd love if you subscribe, rate, and give a raving review wherever you get your podcasts. For more discussion on B2B social media marketing, be sure to follow Oktopost on LinkedIn. And of course, to gain access to all our free social media marketing and employee advocacy resources, head on over to our website, www.oktopost.com. Until next time.